New York City is missing its commuters. On today's Plain English, how America's biggest city is coping with an empty feeling inside. Hi there, everyone. I'm Jeff, and this is Plain English, where we help you upgrade your English with lessons about current events and trending topics. Sure, you could read a textbook, but it's more fun when you're listening to English that you actually want to listen to. And that's why we focus on what's going on in the world. It's a great way to improve your English and learn about the world at the same time. Coming up today, New York has a population of about 8 million people, but those are the people who rest their heads on pillows in the city at night, the people who live there, in other words. Before COVID-19, New York had an additional population, 1 million people who came to the city during the day to work. But a lot of those people are not coming into the city anymore, or they're not coming as often. And that poses a problem for America's biggest city. In the second half of the lesson, we'll talk about the English expression inflection point, and we have a quote of the week. Let's dive in. The morning commute in the New York City region is intense. Some people hop on the subway and get to the office in just a few minutes. When I lived there, I walked 20 minutes. But for the hundreds of thousands of people who come from suburban areas of Long Island, New Jersey, Connecticut, and upstate New York, the commute is a lot more stressful. It involves an early morning alarm, typically driving to a train or a bus station, a long and expensive ride into the city, and then either walking or taking a subway to the office. A 60 or even 90-minute commute is not unusual. And that's on a good day. Throw in a snowstorm or an unexpected delay in service, and it's even worse. So it should come as no surprise that Manhattan office workers are saying no thanks to that long commute every day, even now, 3 years after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. One estimate says that on an average weekday, only about half of commuters with jobs in Manhattan actually come into the office. So it's not true that people aren't going to the office or to Manhattan. They are, but they're not doing it 5 days a week. This is nice for workers, but it presents a number of challenges to America's biggest economic engine. We'll focus on 3 ways the city is struggling because of work from home. First, the vacancy in the office market. Second is the financial situation of public transit agencies. And finally, the service industry that caters to commuters. Start with the office market. With fewer workers coming into the office, companies need less office space. America's national office vacancy rate is 17%, the highest since records began. But even that might mask the true problem. Office leases are long-term, often 10 years. So many leases in place now were signed before the pandemic. When they come up for renewal, the tenants may choose to take less space, pushing the vacancy rate even higher. This is bad because city governments are funded with property taxes. When office vacancies are high, the building values go down. And when building values go down, cities receive less money in taxes. And when they have less tax revenue, they have to cut public services, which hurts everyone. So the first problem is empty offices and the lower tax revenue they'll provide to the city. The second problem is the transit agencies. It's miserable to drive in New York, and most New Yorkers don't have cars. The region has, by far, the biggest transit system in America. It's one of the biggest in the world. But with ridership down 25 or 30%, transit agencies have a big hole in their budgets. These include the New York City subway system, the commuter train services in New York State and New Jersey, and a regional subway system called The Path. All have suffered sharp drops in ridership and, therefore, money. Until now, the national government has come to the rescue, plugging holes in the budget with stimulus money from Washington. But that won't last forever. And if transit agencies cut services, it could cause fewer riders to take the trains and buses if the service isn't frequent enough. And that would make the whole region less desirable to live in. The cuts in public transit are a real threat to the long-term health of America's busiest region. And this, by the way, is not just a New York problem. The same story is playing out in Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. Finally, spare a thought for the huge industry that serves commuters. Restaurants, delis, coffee carts, dry cleaners, shoe shiners, messenger services, copy shops, caterers, flower shops, office cleaners, nail salons, barber shops, news stands, all the people who serve the bustling office scene are now suddenly with 30% or less demand. A lot of businesses have closed and the workers have left the region. And that's not all. High-end restaurants and Broadway shows may be big tourist attractions, and many New York residents enjoy them, but a lot of those tables in expensive restaurants and a lot of those seats in Broadway shows are taken by commuters. Attendance at Broadway shows is way down. The Metropolitan Opera is producing the fewest shows in 40 years. New York is at an inflection point. It has survived many crises before: the September 11th attacks, Hurricane Sandy, the financial crisis. It can survive another. Luckily, the mayor, Eric Adams, and the state governor, Kathy Hochul, are working together on a plan to make Manhattan more of a live, work, play destination, transforming business districts into areas that are friendlier to residents. There's a term in English, a 24-hour city, and that term is reserved for those few cities that seem to be alive all 24 hours of a day. New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, but also Cairo, Beirut, and Montevideo. The mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, turned that phrase on its head and said she wants Paris to be a 15-minute city. And by that, she means whatever you need, park, school, restaurant, office, should be within 15 minutes of your house by transit or bicycle. So you can live in a huge city without these long, soul-sucking commutes common in other big cities. It's a good idea, and that might be part of the future for New York. But it's going to take a lot of work to get there, and New York has a lot of old office buildings that are sitting empty. On Thursday, we'll talk about what can be done with an old and empty office building in a big city. Today's expression is to be at an inflection point. Think back to your days studying math in school, either late in high school or at your university if you studied calculus. Think of a parabola. A parabola is like an arc. First, it's increasing at an increasing rate. This is taking me back. And then it's increasing at a decreasing rate. And then it turns. And now the graph shows it falling again. It's decreasing and so on. The graph looks like the peak of a roller coaster. And that very top point on the graph is the inflection point. It's when the line goes from increasing to decreasing. Now, we didn't talk about calculus on today's lesson, so you probably guessed that inflection point can be used in more general circumstances, and you would be right. An inflection point is a time of significant change. It's that point in time where you know the future is going to be different from the past. In mathematics, the inflection point is very precise. In business or in life, the inflection point is fuzzier. It's not quite as precise, but you use this when you know that big change is coming. Today, I said New York is at an inflection point. Before the pandemic, it welcomed 1 million suburban commuters into the city every day, and a whole economy depended on that. During the pandemic, everyone closed their eyes and pretended life would go back to normal someday. But now it's clear that won't happen. New York is at an inflection point. The future is going to be different from the past. A lot of people are saying these days that universities are at an inflection point with ChatGPT. Prior to ChatGPT, if a student tried to write an essay using artificial intelligence, it would have been obvious, laughable even. But now, ChatGPT can write realistic sounding answers to questions. And it's not inconceivable that students will use ChatGPT to write their essays. Universities then are at an inflection point. What will they do about the use of artificial intelligence like ChatGPT? I don't know. Maybe we'll talk about that in a future lesson. But I do think it's right to say universities are at an inflection point. Whatever was true in the past about artificial intelligence and writing essays, that's not going to be true in the future. This is a point at which there will have to be some big change. The tough thing about this is when you're really at an inflection point, it's not always obvious that you're there. So one thing people do when they want to get others to pay attention is they say in their most serious voice, "We are at an inflection point." And they do this to get you to pay attention. Joe Biden, the world is at an inflection point. Jerome Powell, the head of America's central bank, we are at an inflection point with inflation. Others say we are at an inflection point in Ukraine. We're at an inflection point with artificial intelligence. We're at an inflection point with cryptocurrency. I'm not saying none of these is true. I'm just saying be careful when you hear this. People say this to get you to pay attention. It makes the speaker sound smart because it makes the speaker sound like he or she knows the future. But the truth is, when you're really at an inflection point, it's not always obvious that you're there. Time for a quote of the week. It's about New York City. It's by Le Corbusier, a Swiss architect. He said this: 100 times have I thought New York is a catastrophe, and 50 times it is a beautiful catastrophe. Well, speaking of studying math and inflection points, did you ever have a graphing calculator? Texas Instruments I had. It was called a TI-84. And you'd type formulas into it, and it would graph the formulas. Do they still have those? I have no idea. Anyway, that's all for today's Plain English lesson number 558 for Monday, March 27th, 2023. The full lesson, including exercises, a transcript, a how-to video, and much more, are available at plainenglish.com/558 On Thursday, we'll talk about one of the challenges to remaking a city's downtown in the post-pandemic world, and that is converting old offices into apartments. It's not as easy as you might think. That's coming up on Thursday. See you then.